So we were basically the most aggressive at saying, I'll do a lot of recall checking, number one. And then number two, I know this is going to, shock you because you deal with attorneys and they're always so friendly and helpful, but sometimes they don't agree with each other. And the challenge is you can't actually build machine learning if the human experts can't agree.
Today on LawNext, I speak with Neil Peretz. He's the entrepreneur turned lawyer turned entrepreneur again, who founded Contract Wrangler, an AI-driven contract management platform that was acquired in August by the contract management company Conga. We'll hear his story of starting, building, and selling a legal tech company, and hear his thoughts on two of the hottest topics in legal tech these days, AI and contract management. This is Bob Ambrogi, and you're listening to LawNext, the podcast that features the innovators and entrepreneurs who are driving what's next in law. Neil will join me in just a moment, but first, let me tell you about some of the sponsors who so generously support LawNext. Bill for Time brings modern technology to the legal billing process. Automate your time tracking, create customized invoices, and process online payments all in one place. Learn how Bill for Time can help you work more efficiently today at billfortime.com. That's Bill, the number 4, time.com. Now on to today's conversation. Neil Peretz, welcome to LawNext.
Thank you.
Well, good to have you here. And we're literally kind of just meeting here as we record. So it's a real pleasure to speak with you. I guess kind of the occasion of our speaking is that the company that you started a few years back, Contract Wrangler, was acquired last month. And we'll talk more about that. But I thought it would be fun to kind of catch up with you and talk a little bit about your background and about starting and seeing this company develop over the years and the acquisition, and then some of your thoughts about the industry. So welcome aboard.
Great.
So why don't we start with kind of, if you could, you've got such a fascinating background even before you got to the point of starting Contract Wrangler, but maybe you could kind of give us the nutshell version of who you were and what you were doing before you got around to starting Contract Wrangler.
Yeah, I've tended to hop around a bit on different career activities. I was a psychology graduate student, and then I ended up in a management consulting firm in the greater Boston area. And I was curious actually why anyone would pay me to go consult to their company. And then when I found out that I actually could figure out many of the answers, I thought, well, that probably wasn't sufficiently challenging enough for me. I'd preferred to be in an area where I actually had less competency, and I was really successful in finding that. I ended up as an investment banker in New York, where there was 2 other analysts in the firm that I joined. One who was Phi Beta Cap economics from Princeton, and another one was a double major, I think magna cum laude in accounting and finance from Georgetown. And then there was me, the psychology graduate student. So needless to say, I was kind of behind the 8 ball. A lot of people go to law school or business school after being a banker. And that was actually the path that I was thinking about as well. And I'd applied to some law schools and business schools. But I had the chance to join the government. And basically they said, I'll pay you to go learn another language and go overseas. And that sounded kind of fun. So I ended up not going to law school, which would be the path that a lot of people were on. And I joined the diplomatic service. I guess I've always been interested I like public service work. So that appealed to me, being in the diplomatic service. I also like efficiency for some odd reason I haven't figured out yet. And the diplomatic service isn't the best at that, or the government is not always the best at that. So I ended up leaving and joining, basically starting a company in Silicon Valley. I went and slept on a friend's couch and co-founded what was then the first mass market mobile email company. My friend is a hardware engineer. I have no real skills other than working a lot. So I slept on his couch and ran around and tried to convince people that, yes, I was coming from the government and therefore I was a sure bet to go build a private sector company in Silicon Valley. And that, needless to say, took a lot of persuading.
That was Pocket Mail, right? It was called?
Yeah, but it was Pocket Mail. And actually tied to an early entrepreneurship lesson I had, though, which was that you can actually do work in areas that you don't have a track record in if you really, really stick to it.
Yeah.
And I would go to the Consumer Electronics show and people would wonder, who are these strange people? Who's that guy? And show up a year later and they say, I've seen that guy before. And by the time I'm there the third year in a row, they say, oh, that guy, hey, he's my friend. I'm going to go talk to him.
Right.
Because I guess he stuck
like
around.
The legal tech world.
I mean, if you go to ILTA, right? And I read your column on, not going to ILTA this year.
Yeah,
but,
I didn't go this year.
But generally speaking, yes, if you showed up there repeatedly, people, oh, that guy,
yeah. But wait a minute, is it all email mobile? What is mobile email?
Oh, that was the funniest thing when we were starting this. Well, back then, the inspiration for the company was I was visiting, the co-founder and I were visiting another friend for his wedding in London. This was like 94, 95. And my co-founder was in Silicon Valley and he wanted to tell me about the internet and the web. And I'd already used some online services, but the web was just coming out. And my friend has a bachelor's and master's from MIT, builds hardware, was at Apple at that point building hardware. And it took like 4 trips to the local electronics store and a whole bunch of different dial-ins and hours of time just to get connected to the internet. And I thought, wow, I've got thousands of dollars of computers we're lugging around. We've gone to the store 4 times. I'm traveling with a guy with a bachelor's and master's from MIT, and I still can't even check my messages.
Right.
There must be some better way. So the challenge we set for ourselves was to say, hey, how can I make a really low-cost access system and low-cost devices? And we ended up designing custom hardware, and then we had a service that would connect to all of it. And frankly, we met a lot of skepticism when trying to raise money for the company because people said that's too ambitious. Custom hardware, custom service, running the back end yourself, etc. And we had our telecom network to do it, and we actually did do it all. In retrospect, it was definitely too ambitious, but we achieved it. So the goal was $99 hardware, $10 a month service, and you can get email. You don't need a computer. You don't need a prior account.
Sounded great. What happened to that company?
We were heading into the internet kept growing, and people got all excited, and the board said, hey, you should go public. And they said, why don't you hire a senior tech executive because no one's heard of you. And so we hired a guy actually who was in Massachusetts before. This guy used to run Ashton Tate. I don't know if you remember their database company.
Right,
and then he'd gone out to California. I think he'd actually worked at VisiCorp before, or Personal Software, which published VisiCalc. So he'd been in the software industry for a long time, and thus was more known than me, as are most people in the world. And the funny thing about it, though, was we ended up setting up a joint venture in Australia in the meantime with the local Telstra reseller in Australia. Telstra is the big phone company. We ended up taking the Australian company public on the Australian stock exchange, and that ended up actually buying the U.S. company. So at the end of this whole company ended up publicly traded in Australia, which was a fun experience for me to go out there for board meetings and things like that. Eventually, I started doing something else, though.
Yeah.
I think they kept running the company for 5 or 6 or 7 or more years, and they had a strategy which was, hey, we can make a lot of money if we fire all the engineers, we can make more money. And I think they roughly did that, and that eventually
a brilliant strategy for a tech company, I guess.
That's not a good long-term strategy.
Right. Yeah. So just to fast forward a little bit. I mean, at some point you then went to law school. And
I was always curious. What if I became a lawyer?
Yeah, and practice law. You held various positions as a lawyer. And what was your legal career like before you started this company?
I was working in the government. I was a DOJ trial attorney during the last recession, working on bankruptcies and restructurings. And then I'd help start, the closest we can get to a startup in DC is starting a government agency. So I helped start the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's Office of Enforcement. But I like California law and the entrepreneurial spirit. And after a mere 7 years in DC, I was able to finally persuade my wife to go back to California. And I was an in-house attorney at startups and financial technology companies. And that was really the inspiration for Contract Wrangler. And I think generally slothfulness drives innovation. And you always wish someone else could do all your work. And, being an in-house attorney, yes, I had an aspiration to have some of my in-house work taken care of, which was what really drove ultimately the creation of Contract Wrangler.
Yeah. So let's talk about that. What was the problem you saw? What was it that you set out to try and do with Contract Wrangler?
The problem I saw was that we had no shortage of agreements. We actually had an ever-growing number of agreements in the world. And I think that, Bob, you cover legal tech, so you see all these SaaS companies, and each one can perform a function often very well, maybe better than the human who was doing it before, better, faster, cheaper, etc. The challenge is that we have each one of these services we buy is another contract.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it was a Nobel Prize winner who talked about the theory of the corporation. Why does a corporation exist? And the idea is corporations exist because we can't afford to sign a contract for every little thing we do with every person. So instead, we just have them be our employee, and we just have them do lots of stuff. But I don't need a contract to go get me a coffee, contract to do this, contract to do that. And I think SaaS is really changing that world where now we have many tasks that were done by the human that are done by a third party via SaaS. And the result is we actually have a lot more contracts than we ever did before. And the contracts are super important for really everything. When will this expire? Is there going to be a price increase? When should I expect XYZ service? It all has to be spelled out. Well, normally it'd be, Fred or Susie down the hall, and we could ask, them to hurry up or go slower or something like that. So contracts, the amount of contracts was exploding around me, and I had more and more of them. And the challenge that I saw was there's a big disconnect between drafting the contract and actually implementing it. So a lot of effort, you said your wife had negotiated a lot of contracts.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there's a ton of effort spent negotiating these contracts, but oftentimes they end up in a file cabinet or a Dropbox or wherever afterwards, and there's not so much effort spent on implementing them.
Mm-hmm.
And in part, it's actually not due to a lack of diligence of the lawyer. It's that the contract represents responsibilities across the organization. And the lawyers, I think of like the handmaiden of the contract, but the contract really spells out obligations across the enterprise. But companies have other incentives. They're on to the next activity. Contract signed, it's done. And so where I saw the biggest challenges was not in the negotiating the contracts, but was actually in the carrying them out. Because what I cared about was whether my company was going to be successful as opposed to just whether I'm successful as a cog, if you will.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a contract negotiating cog, if you will. It's one of my functions in the law department.
Right.
But my company has many other obligations tied to the contract, and I was interested in the company being successful, and that went beyond me preparing them. And I saw I had so many contracts. We eventually sold a business unit at Contract Wrangler, and I got all these diligence questions in. Hey, promise you've never signed a contract that ever had XYZ clause in it, that had a most favored nation clause.
Right.
Well, how can I make that promise? I got to go read all the contracts again.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
So I can't. I thought, well, why don't I use contract management, right? That sounds right. Contracts, manage them, solution. And then I found out that they're all empty databases.
Yeah.
And that was really the main inspiration was, wow, none of the existing systems will solve it for you. If Contract Wrangler existed before I had this problem.
They're document repositories, but they're not real.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly. And so I didn't need to start a company. If it existed before, I'd be happy to be a customer, but it didn't. And
right.
That was the inspiration.
Yeah. So what was the approach that you took to be able to, understand these obligations within the agreements that a company has?
I wanted to know the very specific obligations. Do I have to do this by this date? What exactly is indemnified or not indemnified? And I did look at some early people using machine learning. I wasn't the first one ever to think about that.
Yeah.
And
you were pretty early. This 2016, you founded this company, right? So,
yeah.
I don't know if there were a lot out there using machine learning in this area yet.
Seal and Kira were, I think, maybe a first generation, and Raven.
Yep.
Which bought by iManage.
Mm-hmm.
I think those were some of the earliest that are serious companies, right?
Yeah.
They built actual businesses,
right?
And what I thought was different about them from what I wanted was they're focused on the law firm market,
mm-hmm.
and lawyers are paid by the hour at the law firm, and so frankly they do have they're not unhappy to bill hours. They might be unhappy with their quality of their work, but they do want to bill hours, and thus a solution that takes away all their billable hours is probably not so exciting in some ways for them.
Mm-hmm.
I was coming at the in-house perspective, and I don't exist to bill hours at all, actually. So the closer to an answer I could get, a full answer, the better. I didn't need to hit a billable hour target. Tools for law firms weren't appropriate for in-house use because largely what they did, in my view, was what I call clause classification. They would largely direct you to section, hey, look here, here's the indemnification, or here's the MFN clause we think.
Right. And for a specific use case. I mean, Kira's was primarily due diligence review at that point. I mean, maybe it's expanded a little bit beyond that now. Well, now it's just been acquired, but very focused on that use case.
Exactly. And I think it was largely what I call, again, clause classification of I will direct you to a relevant section, but to operationalize it, a lawyer still needs to do work in that section. And that's the hard part is I could give you just the indemnification section and still have all the capital letters and big words, still be like a ton of work to read it, figure it out. And what I wanted was the answer. No, these three things aren't covered. And the existing systems didn't do that. So that was, I set out to say, well, how can I go to the next level? Can I actually get the actual very specific answer from the system beyond clause classification? And the answer is, yes, I can. And it's really freaking hard.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I was going to ask. I remember I talked to Kira's founders actually on this podcast not long ago, earlier this year, because it was their, was it their 10th anniversary this year, I think it was?
Yep, they're some of the pioneers.
And they were talking about that very point about how they had this idea of what they wanted to do, but implementing the idea turned out to be a lot harder than they thought it was going to be. And for the first couple of years, they basically had no revenue or not really even a product, a viable product. It took them a while to get out of the gate and get something going. So what was that process like for you?
I actually had multiple false starts. I don't know if there's analogous to some of the Cure experiences or not with, when they were starting, but I knew that first I met someone who was a self-declared AI super genius. I hearkened to Wile E. Coyote, super genius there. I had initially been approached. He was going to use AI to do something else. A friend said, talk to this guy, he's really smart. And I said, okay, well, the problem you want to solve is interesting, but it doesn't come up that much. I need help with contract. Can you do that? And the person said, oh, sure, no problem. So I said, oh, good, here's 100 NDAs. Let's see if you can build a system to figure out the following, 5 things in NDAs. And weeks went by, nothing. More weeks went by, nothing. Eventually I said, you got to show me something. And he came back to me eventually and said, aha, I figured out that if there's a zip code, if there's a known zip code of this line, the rest of the address might be on that line too. It's like, that explains 5% of what you want to figure out. And that took me 2 months. So if I take, multiply that by 20 times 5%, we'll be there, right? And, things don't actually work that way. Usually they get harder as you go. So I wasn't very optimistic about that approach. But in the meantime, I'd actually gone and talked to other GCs. And I asked, hey, how do you know what's in your agreements? Do you ever have these problems? And they all said, yeah. Ooh, that'd be great. That'd be amazing if you could solve this. So I thought, I'm not the only one with a problem, but there's not a solution. So I was talking to some friends who are software engineers who, I'm in Silicon Valley. And software engineers have this idea that everything else is simple. It's just a matter of software. A software engineer should be able to figure out everything, which is why many times we have these crazy companies come out of Silicon Valley that wouldn't actually work in the real world, but somehow someone says, well, I'm a software engineer, I should be able to figure out everything. Yeah. So in this case, my friend said, well, we'll just use Watson, right? IBM, that'll do it. Or we use Stanford has an open source natural language processing tools.
If it could win Jeopardy, it can do anything.
Oh, exactly. At least that's what's gotten them some initial deals. That not to deliver. If you go read their story with MD Anderson Cancer Center, you'd say, well, the Jeopardy's a lot easier than curing cancer or what have you, or reading contracts. Yeah. So it turned out we got crap results, super crap results. Like I could have a college student do better than that, and I kept looking, and eventually I finally met my CTO for Contract Wrangler. And it's someone who did his PhD in computer science. His dissertation was on text analytics. And he actually finished his PhD in 94. So for, at that point, 22 years, he'd been building text analytics systems. And he would be the first to admit he doesn't know everything. But what he did know is he'd made a lot of mistakes before. So at least could not make those again. He could have some very strong instincts, and it was really under his leadership that we ended up building a system that could eventually get to the super granular, guaranteed correct result.
Yeah. So how long did that take?
2000, so probably a couple of years of building before we went into an alpha with third parties. And then we started being able to charge people some money for service, although just a little bit at the beginning, in the third year of building stuff.
Yeah. Neil Peretz founded Contract Wrangler with a vision of what he wanted in a post-execution contracts platform, which was to not just find clauses in contracts, but to provide answers to what was in those contracts. Developing that technology turned out to be more of a challenge than he initially thought, but after a couple of years and several false starts, he arrived at a viable product. Then the challenge became selling it to a sometimes skeptical market. We'll hear more about that when we return. But first, these words from the sponsors whose support makes this show possible. Paradigm is changing the legal landscape. With their practice management solutions Practice Panther, Bill for Time, and Mariscase, and the online payment solution HeadNote, legal professionals can easily manage their practice anytime, anywhere. More than 40,000 lawyers trust Paradigm to automate and grow their practice. Learn more at joinparadigm.com. Welcome back to LawNext. After founding Contract Wrangler in 2016 and spending 2 years getting the product to where he wanted it, Neil Peretz faced a new challenge, that of taking it to market and building sales. As we return to LawNext, we discuss how he got from that point to the company's acquisition in August by Conga. We also talk about his thoughts more generally on AI and contract management and why he believes Contract Wrangler's approach was unique. Now, at some point, you were CEO, and then did you step aside as CEO, and somebody else came in,
Yep.
and you also brought in a venture round or something around that time? Is that what happened? Or I'm trying to figure. Yeah.
I'd raised angel funding for the company.
Yeah.
Initially, I was funding everything out of my pocket,
Yeah.
much to my wife's concern.
Right.
I said we sold the family cow for some magic AI beans.
Yeah.
So eventually, I had angel investors who were, kind enough to support the vision, and then I raised first venture capital round. And given that larger enterprises seemed like good customers, I and the venture people decided we were going to recruit someone to be the CEO who really had a lot of enterprise software background. And I'm happy for enterprises, but I didn't take the enterprise software sales class in law school. It's not even my aspiration to have taken it if it existed. So that's why we actually recruited someone who'd spent 20 plus years doing enterprise software.
Yeah. But
the
you've
CEO.
remained involved with the company throughout. You're still were general counsel and a board member and
Yep.
and of course the founder. So once you got to the point of having a somewhat viable product or a more than somewhat viable product, what was the process of starting to build up sales around that? What was that like?
So a lot of one of the interesting stats that came out towards the latter part was, I think, a vindication of my vision that really everyone in the company needs to care about contracts. Is 80% of the users of Contract Wrangler are not in the legal department.
Sales,
And it was that,
procurement,
sure, risk, compliance, all of those, IT, and it was actually getting out and talking to users about either pain points. What did they get wrong that they were losing on, or B, how could they do better in their company? And it made an interesting thinking process because lawyers always risk. And what we were trying to do was say, we're going to help your actual business. You, for example, will have greater customer retention. Okay, that's not something most legal tech products are out selling.
Mm-hmm.
So it did make it more challenging to then go out and spend time with non-legal personas and talk about their business and say, what are the real areas where you need the help, where you can have a strategic advantage in your company.
Yeah.
But it was real gratifying when we found those. But we had to go, many times it was a multi-threaded sale where there could be a business stakeholder, but they still want to check with legal because it's contracts.
Right. So you're having to sell to the legal department, but you're having to also sell to other stakeholders within the client, within the customer's company.
I don't have to sell to the others, but
Yeah.
I have an opportunity to do it because of the business advantage they can have, as opposed to just saying, legal, you save 20 minutes contract or something like this, right? Where they're really the only buyer for that.
Yeah. I know you're not a sales guy per se, but
No.
one of the truisms I think I hear all the time is that selling to lawyers or selling to legal professionals is a whole different world than sales in any other sector. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, lawyers, and I've had lawyers involved in product management as well, and so many of the aspects of them that you adore sometimes are equally challenging. It's for many lawyers, the concept of the great being the enemy of the good is like omnipresent. And I am a lawyer, so we're almost taught and we're encouraged to be extremists.
Yeah.
And we set up this adversary system, at least here in the United States. I've got to be a zealous advocate for my client.
Right.
I've got to look ahead. I've got to imagine every possible thing that can go wrong. So, if I talk to a lawyer about a product and I say, hey, this will solve, 97% of all the circumstances, they'll say, great, go away, come back when it's 100%. Like, you don't want to be better at your 97%?
Right.
And I'll save you half your day? No, come back at 100%.
Right, yeah. Which doesn't exist, but...
Yeah, it might never exist. And the concept of cost benefit is really lacking for many lawyers.
Yeah. Over that time, it's something I meant to ask you earlier, but just when you kind of first did start bringing the product to market and started trying to begin sales efforts around it, marketing efforts around it, what was the general reception? I mean, did people get what you were trying to do? Did they appreciate what you were trying to do?
Well, certainly it was pretty funny among investors too. Reactions could be something like, no, that's not possible. That's one. Or alternatively, isn't that done already? Or if I would go see investors, this was very funny. I'd say, I can't believe that people don't know what's in their contracts. Well, they didn't work in the law department, right? So they assumed something that egregious couldn't be going on, but it was. But it was so egregious, they couldn't imagine it.
Yeah.
So going to see customers, I think they needed to just go try it out. And that's actually what we ended up doing.
Yeah.
It was hard to believe that we could be that efficacious. And it was actually we had this tremendous trial conversion rate, right? So when people try the product, then they didn't want to give it up.
Yeah.
But that really ended up being an upfront cost on our part to let people try it out.
Yeah.
And what was important about Contract Wrangler is, to my knowledge, I'm not behind the scenes, but to my knowledge, it's the most heavy QC of any system on the market. And
what do you mean by that?
You deal with a lot of legal tech. There's this concept of people, process, and technology.
Right.
So, technology, we talk about, it's TensorFlow or whatever that is. That's like a subset of the technology, but that alone won't solve your problems. It's like saying I have, Lotus 1, 2, 3, and I've solved all my financial problems, financial services. Like, no, that is just a empty spreadsheet. You need to go do stuff on top. Just like I could have TensorFlow or something, and it doesn't solve anything. TensorFlow is to, contract management as like VisiCalc or Lotus 1, 2, 3 is to Oracle Financials. I mean, they're like, whoa, you got to do a lot more work on top of that.
Right.
So people didn't appreciate that. In order for us to do QC, then we had to bring in a lot of subject matter experts. And then we noticed, okay, we need to go QC the results because that's how you get better. That's the way humans get better too.
Yeah.
And it was not just the case where we have to go throw a pile of humans at it. Because these days, people finally start to acknowledge this. They say, I have a human in the loop. Okay. Is that human an attorney? And very often, no, it's not.
Right.
And then you say, well, and they say, I have an attorney loop. Okay, well, is an attorney looking at everything? Well, no, they just kind of spot check. Okay, well, that's not the same. And the reason is because you end up with recall problems. So you're trying to measure precision of recall or some of your key metrics for the machine learning.
Right.
And recall being, did I catch everything? And a lot of law work, e-discovery is a good example of this, is about precision, right? I have these big results and I'm trying to weed out the false answers.
Right.
I don't know what didn't make it into my pile of answers though. And that's a recall problem. And the only way I can know that, what was not caught by my search criteria, is to look at everything.
Right.
And that's why you actually need a human loop. So we were basically the most aggressive at saying, I'll do a lot of recall checking, number one. And then number two, I know this is going to, shock you because deal with attorneys and they're always so friendly and helpful, but sometimes they don't agree with each other. And the challenge is you can't actually build machine learning if the human experts can't agree.
Yeah.
So you actually have to build in, it's not just say, I have an attorney in the loop. Even if I have an attorney in the loop for everything, do you have multiple attorneys? Are you running them in parallel and pairing them to see whether they agree? Are you QCing the attorneys themselves? Because, again, it's hard for attorneys to believe, but they are fallible.
Right.
And they can sometimes correctly disagree. But the problem is, if they disagree, even for a policy reason, you end up with seemingly random machine learning.
Right.
So we actually had built a gigantic back-end system where we actually had attorneys doing QC on the recall side, and then actually QCing the attorneys and having quality control on them. And it's your human experts and process control of them and training of them that really matters a lot. Almost as much as your brilliant software expertise. And I think we were probably the first and the biggest investor in that.
Yeah. So you had not just people in the loop, you had subject matter experts, attorneys in the loop, and then redundancy around those subject matter experts.
And systems to then check, say, if the machine thinks this is X%, I will automatically route this one to 2 attorneys. I will automatically check and see whether the attorneys agree. I will, if they don't agree X many times, I will call a timeout and ask, why did you say this? Why did you say that? And it could be a policy decision. And if that's the case, you need to actually set a policy rule for your engine.
Yeah.
Example being, you and I have a contract, let's say, for a year, and it starts January 1st. So when does it end? Does it end December 31st, or does it end January 1st the next year? Well, people can differ, right? So one attorney can say it ends December 31st, another one, different jurisdiction, whatever, January 1st. So then we would say, well, we need to pick a policy that we consistently apply for our own machine learning. Otherwise, our machine learning will sometimes pick one, sometimes pick the other.
Right.
So you have to actually spot where your attorneys are not agreeing and then have interventions.
Yeah.
And you also need to develop ontologies because, if you talk about a limited liability clause, there's subcategories of, well, what types of liabilities are you limiting? And unless this requires subject matter expertise. This is why I'm not bullish on people without a lot of legal subject matter expertise building these things, because I have to say, well, what are the subcategories that I should be trying to find within a limit of liability? And unless I have the deep subject matter knowledge, and I then force all my QCers to check, am I into the right subcategory, I can't build it. And that's not something any software person's going to know.
Yeah. In recent years in particular, several other companies have come on the market that are sort of focused on that idea of sort of pulling the data out of contracts and making it so that you can understand what is in your contracts. Do you think, as compared to those companies, your approach was still unique, or are they doing more or less the same thing, or do you have a sense of that?
I think that they are. So, of companies, let's see. So I see out there, like, at least I read about, right? I don't necessarily bump into, but, Alexion, Evasort, Link Squares, as some examples.
Yeah.
And I think they're all in what I call the second generation of AI and contracts, as is Contract Wrangler, in that they are for in-house people. They're not just a tool for a law firm to use. And frankly, we saw that the founder of Kira is going to build something more in-house focused as well. I take that as a form of flattery. Because in the early years, people always say, what about Kira? And I said, no, more contracts are actually in-house, and there's more operational impacts to working on this in-house. And I haven't had a conversation with him, and he certainly has had great accomplishments in building Kira the way he did, but evidently he thinks there's probably some merit to that perspective as well, I guess, from his activities. Well,
as do a number of investors all across Silicon Valley these days, I think. But
Sure. And the knowable guys as well, right?
Yeah, right.
The knowable guys were going to go build some in-house thing. It's some of these people I bump into. The areas so I think those companies are all second generation, and they all deal with what we'll call post-execution, right? Mm-hmm. We have other companies like Law Geeks and Legal Sifter helping on negotiation and review.
Right.
So I do that as one dividing line. Am I
sort of pre-signature, post-signature idea?
Right. Am I implementing the contract, trying to get the value out, or am I just negotiating it? And where I came at it was I was trying to implement things because that's what had the biggest dollar impact for my company.
Yeah.
Some things I negotiate forever, they never get signed. But I knew that even if it was a bad contract, if I signed it, we had to do it, or they had to do it. So the differentiator I have is how granular do they get? And my perception of some of those other companies is that they're not as granular. Well, actually, I'd say my perception of all of them is they're not as granular as Contract Wrangler, as we got a Contract Wrangler about the very specific detail, not just saying, here's the section to go look at, but saying, the answer is 12. And in many cases, the answer, let's say the answer is September 12th, that answer might not be written in the contract anywhere. So you actually need to build inference engines then on top of your machine learning. I'll give you a particular example. I could have a contract that I'm supposed to figure out when it ends. And it ends in the agreement, it says it ends 2 months after the maturity date. Great. When's the maturity date? Now I got to figure out what's the maturity date. Figure out the maturity date. The maturity date is, 1 year and 3 months after the starting date. When's the starting date? That was the date of the last signature on the agreement. These are not far-fetched scenarios.
Right,
these happen all the time.
Yeah.
Or the later of January 12th of the date you moved into the property. There's no way the actual word September 12th is never written anywhere in the contract.
Right.
So I need to start building these inference engines and logic engines on top of the contract. And so Contract Wrangler's gone through the painstaking process of building those to get to the answer just saying it's September 12th, as opposed to say, I point you to this section. Now you go follow the threads back around.
Yeah. So you're delivering the answer on a silver platter.
That's enough to the point where it actually feeds into their business systems. And that's actually where you get back to the bridging from legal to the rest of the company.
Yeah.
Is we have people pushing the data to Salesforce and Workday and NetSuite and Oracle Financials and other business systems because they got the very specific answer. I can't push a paragraph to Workday. It doesn't work, right?
Right.
And that's the challenge for legal, is getting down to a very business specific if I want to then make it useful outside my department.
Yeah. So coming up to the present time, as I said, Congo, which has its own CLM system, just last month.
More than one even.
More than one. Do they have more than one?
I don't know. I mean, there was Congo and Aptus were merged, right?
That's right too. Yeah.
They had a lot of capabilities.
Right.
They had multiple strong products, and I'm not sure how they're putting them together.
Yeah. And so they've acquired Contract Wrangler. And do you have a sense of how they're pulling Contract Wrangler into that mix, or what's happening there?
I think it really filled a big hole for them in that they are, some of the dominant products in the market that they had for preparing contracts and other tools for that purpose, whether it be procure to pay or quote to cash, but they didn't have a capability to understand what was in all your existing agreements. So that's really the hole that Contract Wrangler fills. And Contract Wrangler hadn't built anything on the other side, right? Which was to say, I'll help you draft something. If we look at some of the other companies I mentioned, like an Evisort or LinkSquares, I believe they are trying to build some types of authoring tools, right? So they're in a world where we could say, is their authoring tool as good as a Congo or Aptus or a purpose-built big-scale system? I don't know the answer to that. I can't compare those things. Whereas Contract Wrangler was kind of a pure play, and Congo and Aptus were a pure play. So at least the aspiration is, it's like the best of breed for either of those without an overlap.
Yeah, well, it kind of goes back to that question we were talking about before we started recording today of many companies call themselves contract lifecycle management companies, but it all comes down to what is a life cycle and what do you mean by that, I guess.
It feels like you're just, the life cycle of many of them is like, it's hilarious actually. It's almost Orwellian, the way they appropriated that term life cycle. It's as if the life ends when you signed it. I signed it and I stored it. And even if that's being maybe a little bit hyperbolic, but the truth is there's only a small amount of data known, metadata, specific data known about those contracts, even if they're authored in the system, which is like, I typed in a expiration date. Okay, so I can save that discrete expiration date somewhere else. But there's so much data that was contained in the template that I didn't actually capture discretely, number one. And I think it's either hubris or kind of a intentional mismarketing that you can only use a contract management system for some types of contracts. So let's imagine we use it for the salespeople, right? That's a really popular use case. Aptus was $1 billion company based on great capabilities to empower salespeople to put out different types of contracts with this quote to cash, configure price quote systems. That was just the sales contracts. That didn't count the procurement contracts, the employment contracts, and all the other types of agreements that a company has. So, boy, much of your universe isn't even covered by those systems, even if you did use them to generate your agreements.
Right. Yeah. So what happens now with you? You've already moved on to another project, as I understand it.
Yeah, I've been helping the Conga folks just transition some things, but I'm probably too much of a bull in a china shop to be too helpful there. They're
After this interview, they'll throw you out. Yeah,
they're a big ship. Oh, they threw me out.
No.
It's okay. They're a big ship. They have lots of, again, other capabilities and strengths that they built up.
Yeah.
So there's integration work that they're doing. I've been working on another legal tech business. One of the areas that I think about with tech generally is, to some extent, tech has just made things more complex as opposed to easier. And I'm interested in situations where I can apply tech to actually make things easier or more accessible. And I have an access to justice of a sort hat on. And so the new endeavor I'm working on is related to certain legal processes related to claims and certain types of claims like creditor claims and bankruptcy, where if you're not very wealthy, you can be priced out of the market for, vindicating your claim, because we are in a society that is complicated and lawyers are very expensive. So the result is, if your claim is not of a certain size or you're not of a certain amount of means, you're boxed out from getting the right help and assistance. And essentially you have what I think of as often a might makes right scenario. And that's not to say the mighty are always wrong. Sometimes they're correct, but sometimes the mighty prevail solely because they're mighty, not because they otherwise deserve it on the other basis. So I'm looking at how can I use technology to level the playing field.
So where are you? You're starting the process all over again here in terms of getting a company up and running. Where are you in all of that, and when might you be bringing that to market?
Well, we're actually in a sort of very quiet MVP for it right now for the first offering, which was helping smaller creditors with claims in bankruptcy proceedings. Not filing bankruptcy, but if you are owed money by someone who's bankrupt.
Yeah, right.
It's an area of law I practiced in. It's super complicated to maximize your recovery. So you really do want to get expert help. And we've been building expert systems to help you achieve that, the generic better, faster, cheaper, as we talk about in SaaS. So that's live in an MVP basis, but we have more scaling work to do. And then we're in probably a sort of alpha design basis on a property claims product next. It's not as much the big corporate enterprise sale. Could be individuals or customers or small businesses. I'm very interested in using tech to try to level the playing field.
Yeah. So Contract Wrangler was not your first entrepreneurial gig, but now that you've been through the process of seeing this company launched and built and sold, wondering if you have any advice or thoughts for other entrepreneurs out there who are starting or building up legal technology companies.
Yeah, you hit on a good one earlier, which was be careful about selling to lawyers. Boy.
That's the trouble with legal tech companies, right?
Right. If you just get rid of the lawyers, it'd be fine. And it's trying to get so certainly some of the advice is knowing the difference between the law firm customer and the in-house customer in terms of what they want. And then otherwise it's how do I get beyond the law department? But even within that, I have to characterize who I'm selling to, because some people in the law department, frankly, just care about saving themselves 15 minutes. And they're not really thinking that much about what's my impact on the overall business, whereas others are bigger system thinkers. So you've got to go calibrate that at the beginning and know your audience.
Yeah, I mean, again, one of the truisms we hear all the time these days is that law departments themselves have transformed significantly over the last decade or so from, kind of in-house legal advisors to more of, business units within a company and have a greater sense of their role in the company in that sense. Have you seen that from your dealings with them? Just to put you on the spot?
To some extent, they're forced to. I remember back when I joined, I was at the Department of Justice many years ago, and I joined there, and I was talking to some administrative people, and I asked for help with something, and a woman said, honey, don't worry about it. You're an attorney. Attorneys are in charge of everything here at the DOJ, because basically it's like a law firm, right? It's the government's law firm. But if you go, and same thing with the law firm, the attorneys have the biggest say, right? They're attorneys in the law firm. When you go to a corporation, the attorneys have no say. They're like the poor stepchildren, right? So to some extent, they've been kicked into being a business support unit just because they're at the beck and call of other sales, or others have the budget and more sway in the overall system. I think in industries where compliance is more tricky or more relevant, then law departments probably been better able to hold their own and not just be a service unit to a degree.
Yeah. Well, Neil, I've done it again, which is I always tell my guests I'm going to talk to them for 30 minutes, and then it always turns out to be so interesting that we keep going well beyond that. But any last words that you'd like to share before we wrap up this conversation today?
I was excited to read your blogging and listen to your podcast and hear the great variety of things that people are thinking about in the legal world. So I guess my biggest statements are, for those trying to innovate, boy, don't give up. We all need your help. It's truly a matter of trying to counteract, the complexity that our own system brings to this. Is I think there's a lot of promise for tech and design to actually make our system more fair and promote better decision making. And that's, it can be quite a grind as a legal tech entrepreneur. If you're out pitching for money, just tell people you're fintech or something like that, regtech, something like that. Try to avoid those lawyer labels wherever you can.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on the sale of Contract Wrangler, and look forward to hearing more about your next venture. And thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me today.
Thanks, Bob.
I've been speaking today with Neil Peretz, the founder of Contract Wrangler, which was acquired in August by Conga. Thanks to Neil for taking the time to speak with me today. What are your thoughts on today's show? Share them by tweeting us at LawNext Podcast. LawNext is produced, engineered, and edited by Populous Radio. I'm your host, Bob Ambrogi. I hope you'll join us again next time for another episode of LawNext.